Sunstein, just yesterday, I met with business leaders of the forest products industry in my state. And once again, they wanted to talk to me about the EPA Boiler MACT rules, which govern emissions. And you and I have had many conversations about those rules. And Senator Landrieu and Senator Pryor, Senator Alexander, there are many of us who have been concerned. In fact, 41 senators signed a letter that Senator Landrieu and I headed up to the EPA. And the EPA has clearly made some progress. You've been very helpful in that regard since its first attempt to propose a rule. But the fact is that this is still, if it goes forth, going to be an enormously expensive rule. The estimates are $5 billion for the forest products industry alone, $14 billion for general manufacturing. And my frustration is, how do we get EPA to better consider the economic impact of its rules, particularly the impact on jobs in the first place, unless we mandate it by law? If this kind of rule, which the first draft of which was so onerous and burdensome to the very fragile forest products industry and manufacturing sector, if this kind of rule was so off base and so expensive to start with, I have very little confidence that we can get reforms administratively. That's why I think we need to have legislation.
Well, I completely appreciate the point. The first sentence of the new executive order has the words job creation in them. And for that final rule, as for all rules that have measurable and potentially significant impacts on jobs, that sentence of the executive order is taken really seriously. So if you look at EPA expensive proposals, they have careful analysis of job impacts. And that's something the President has really charged us to do. That is now built into the system. With respect to the rule you mentioned, that's been stayed indefinitely, as I recall, in part by reference to the need for increased public comment and taking account of public comment on those issues. And the job impacts, that's something that not only for that rule, but for all of them, the President has charged us to really focus on.
I guess what I'm saying is we need to build that into the process at the beginning of the process, rather than having these rules come out that are so onerous. And I know you're working toward that, but I for one, think we need to legislate in that area.
Well, I agree with the premise completely, that if a proposed rule would have significant job impacts, but the job impacts are not explored, that's a problem. And you may have noticed that an EPA rule, sometimes referred to as EGU MACT, which is also an important anti-pollution initiative with potentially very significant benefits, that has an analysis of job impacts at the proposal stage. And another provision of the executive order kind of builds on the theme. It requires, for the first time really, agencies to engage with affected members of the public, including those who would be burdened by a rule, before they issue a notice of proposed rulemaking. And that's a way of getting hold of potentially adverse effects on the economy. And as I'm sure you've noticed, in fact, some of this you were a leader on, there have been rules that have been altered or withdrawn for careful engagement with those who would be adversely affected, in part because the President has called for that form of advance engagement.
And I do appreciate that, and we have made some progress on the biomass rule, for example.